Do the Buffalo Bills have any trade candidates on the roster? I'm going to examine the defensive positions to find the most likely options today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Happy Thursday to you, and thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, or if you are joining us on the YouTube channel, your first watch every day. Well, yesterday on the podcast, we went through all of the offensive positions and tried to find the most likely trade candidate at each position. And we reflected on the trades that Brandon Beane made regarding sending away offensive players. Today, we're going to do all the same stuff, but for the defensive side of the football. And there's some heavy hitters on the defensive side of the football. There's some heavy hitters that we can talk about. And it should lead to some good conversation today on the podcast. But before we get into the candidates for this year, let's quickly reflect on the trades that Brandon Beane has made since becoming the Bills general manager to send a defensive player off the roster to another team. And there's not as many defensively as there is offensively, but there's one trade in here that really stands out to me as a good one. So in 2017, obviously the most active trade year for the Bills as they were stockpiling assets to make sure they would have what it was needed to get a quarterback in the 2018 NFL Draft. The Bills traded away cornerback Ronald Darby to the Eagles for wide receiver Jordan Matthews and a third-round pick. They sent linebacker Reggie Ragland to the Chiefs for a fourth-round pick. That was a big win. I couldn't believe that they were able to flip Reggie Ragland coming off of like an ACL tear, a complete non-fit for Sean McDermott's defense. To get a 4 for him from the Chiefs, it's a great trade. It's a great trade. Cornerback Kevon Seymour to the Panthers for wide receiver Kalen Clay and a 7th-round pick. Defensive tackle Marcel Darius to the Jaguars for a 6th-round pick. So that's 2017. Nothing in 2018. 2019, here's a really good trade. The Bills sent defensive end Eli Harold to the Eagles for offensive lineman Ryan Bates. Low-key, super good trade for the Bills. Then in 2021, Daryl Johnson to the Panthers for a 6th-round pick. And you guys remember that. I mean, the Bills were so loaded at defensive end, you were wondering who they were going to cut. And I think it was very fortunate they were able to get a 6 for Daryl Johnson, a guy they took in the 7th round a couple of years prior. I think that's really good resource management when it comes to that deal. So let's do it. Let's go through these position groups and talk about where there could be some trade candidates. And we'll start with the defensive tackle position. And it feels like, and this will apply to defensive tackle and defensive end. The Bills are going to value depth at both of these spots, which somewhat makes it less likely that they would part with one of these players. I mean, we saw the Bills roster Trent Murphy for that entire season where it just made no sense. He was inactive a lot of the time. They had a very big cash savings that they could have, or cap savings, and they held on to him just to protect the depth. So that's always important for us to keep in mind as we consider possibilities like this for the defensive line. Brandon Beane, the position group that every year it seems like he continues to prioritize and invest in, it's the D-line. And so I don't think he's going to be overly eager to get rid of any of his defensive linemen. Let's look at defensive tackle, though, as we start this. Ed Oliver, Daquan Jones, Jordan Phillips, Tim Settle, Brandon Bryant, Eli Anku, your players. I think they really like that top four, and Oliver, Jones, Phillips, and Settle. I don't think those guys are going anywhere. And then you have, Brandon Bryant, who's a really outstanding athlete, who's been in the league for a while. And same thing with Eli Anku, guy who's been in the league, is actually, both of those guys have been called up for games and played for the Bills. I mean, this is a really rock-solid depth chart. But I do look at Bryant and Anku as the two guys that they could send for a late-round pick. I would say this is unlikely. I think they're going to love to keep those guys around on the practice squad to be able to call up. But if I had to pick, I would focus in on Bryant or Anku as the most likely trade candidate for the Bills' defensive tackles. Need to tell you guys about Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar on the planet. So many delicious flavors and so many different styles that we don't talk enough about. They have the Built Bar, which is your typical chocolate-covered protein bar. And typical is probably not the right word because it is a protein bar, but it tastes like a candy bar. It's absolutely delicious. They also have the Puffs, which are phenomenal. They're actually my favorites. And I'm not even a marshmallow guy, but it's like a chocolate-covered marshmallow that's infused with protein, and it's awesome. They have great flavors there. And then the granola. I think granola is phenomenal. I love the white chocolate berry. They've got a peanut butter chocolate. They have a chocolate coconut. All three flavors are really, really good, and they're all healthy for you. So all of them, the bars, the puffs, the granola, covered in 100% real chocolate, but they're low calorie, low sugar, and high in protein. The macros are just off the charts, and it doesn't seem to matter what flavor I try. They're always super good. And this blend of healthy but also delicious is a needle that Built has absolutely threaded, and I'm pretty hooked. I eat them all the time. I have them for breakfast a lot of times. It's a great snack, and I don't feel bad about it because they're super good for you, and they taste delicious. If you want to try Built Bars, check them out. Go to Built.com. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off your next order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Let's go to the defensive end position. Von Miller, Gregory Rousseau, A.J. Epinesa, Boogie Basham, Shaq Lawson, Mike Love. I think the name here that could garner the most attention, the most logical guy to bring up is A.J. Epinesa. Entering his third season, has not really made much of an impact his first 2 years. We kind of gave him a pass as a rookie because he was transforming his body. And then we got all excited to see him in year two. And he'll always have that Dolphins game, right? And look, A.J. Epinesa has not been a bad player. He just hasn't fulfilled the promise of being a second-round pick. I think he's a rotation-worthy player at this point. And you get excited about him taking a step and commanding a larger role and performing well for this defense. I don't think he's a lost cause or anything like that. But as I consider the options here that could have the most appeal, A.J. Epinesa is the name that stands out to me. Especially because you do have Shaq Lawson. And you do have Mike Love. And Mike Love's a player that's worth mentioning because this guy has been around. I mean, when's the last time Mike Love wasn't part of the Buffalo Bills? Whether that was on the practice squad or an injured reserve. I mean, this guy is always around. He's kind of like an Ike Bucker, if you will. And maybe it's his time, right? Maybe it's time for him to do his thing. And the Bills feel good about him as the fifth defensive end, and Shaq Lawson is the fourth, and Boogie is the third, and obviously your top two in Groot and Von Miller, which kind of opens up the door to say, all right, well, A.J. Epinesa is the guy. Now, I don't think that Mike Love's going to have a whole lot of value to other teams. I think the reason he's interesting for the Bills is because they've spent so much time around him and they know who he is. And I think that there's a good vibe when I consider the stuff that the coaching staff has said about Mike Love and even some of the teammates. I feel like he's kind of a guy that at a very minimum would be on the practice squad. But Shaq Lawson was traded last offseason from the Dolphins to the Texans and cut from the Texans and signed by the Jets and then cut by the Jets and was unsigned for a while. And so just like I said yesterday on some of the offensive positions, if the NFL wanted Shaq Lawson, I think that there would have been a bigger market for him, not only this free agency period, but when he was available multiple times last year, 3 different opportunities for teams to acquire him. He couldn't stick with the Texans or the Jets. Now, I think that he'll come to Buffalo to be his best opportunity to refine his form. I'm excited about Shaq Lawson, but as I consider him through the lens of a trade, I don't really find the traction, if you will. So AJ Epinesa, my leader in the clubhouse. Moving on to linebacker. Tremaine Edmonds, Matt Milano, Terrell Bernard, 3rd-round pick. Tyrell Dodson, Tyler Matakevich, Balin Spector, 7th-round pick. Markel Lee, Joe Giles Harris, and Andre Smith, who is facing a 6-game suspension to start the season. Now, maybe some of you guys are saying, well, Tremaine Edmonds, contract year, you don't want to pay him, you don't think he's that good. Obviously, go back and listen to the Tremaine Edmonds pod from last week. But I don't see that being the case. I don't think the Bills, right? Like, just forget everything that you think about Tremaine Edmonds. Do you think that the Bills, who have acknowledged Tremaine Edmonds as the leader of their defense and talk about how valuable he is, traded up to get him in the 1st round a few years ago, do you think that they're going to sit here chomping at the bit to trade this guy when they're preparing to go on a Super Bowl run? Because you're not going to get anything back from him this year. Like, you'd have to have a very meaningful player-for-player swap. The Bills, as a contender, aren't going to be in the business of trading away guys that they're counting on to be pillars of their team. So, predictively, and again, like I said, regardless of the way you think about Tremaine Edmonds, it's about what the Bills think of Tremaine Edmonds. And do you think that they're going to tell a locker room that's gearing up for a Super Bowl run that, hey, the leader of your defense, gone. We don't want him anymore. We want the $12 million in cap space back, and we want a 2nd-round pick in the 2023 NFL draft. That ain't going to fly. So he's not my pick here. I said all that to say that Tremaine Edmonds is not my pick, and maybe for some people, he would be. He's not for me. And that's being predictive. And all of this has been predictive. It's not what Joe Marino would do. This is me trying to be predictive and examine this and find the most likely courses. And so it's kind of difficult here at linebacker because, like I've talked about with a lot of different position groups, it's hard to find the guy here that you feel like represents some level of value where a team is going to give you something to get that player. The one guy that I could talk myself into very loosely, because I'm forcing myself to pick at least one player at every position, is Markel Lee. You know, Markel Lee, a guy that's been rostered in the league for a bit, has been exposed to a lot of different coaching staffs. And look, that's something that matters. When you have a connection or a tie and you kind of expand your branches to other organizations because a position coach that you knew here or there is now here or there, and you know, they're bringing familiar faces. It's just something that happens across the NFL. And Markel Lee, with his time with the Raiders and kind of the turnover in the coaching staff there, his time in Buffalo and a little bit of coaching staff adjustments as well. Maybe somebody out there would want an experienced player like Markel Lee that's started games and has had some good moments. And you feel like from a Bills perspective, he seems kind of expendable, especially with the 3rd-round investment in Bernard. You know, Tyrell Dodson is a guy that's been around, even a draft pick like Balin Spector, not to mention Joe Giles Harris as a bench player. And Andre Smith. You know, I think the suspension there complicates that situation, but I think the Bills have enough linebacker depth, enough likable linebacker depth that Markel Lee is a guy that is on the outside looking in when it comes to this roster, but also may have some appeal as you consider other destinations and as you force yourself to pick at least one player at each position group. Let's shift gears to the secondary here. Cornerback and safety as our last 2 position groups. Cornerback, Trey White, Dane Jackson, Kyer Elam, Taron Johnson, Christian Benford, Saran Neal, Nick McLeod, Elijah Griffin, Tim Harris, Cam Lewis, Christian Benford. This is another tough one here. This was a tough one because I want to have logic, right? I don't want to just say, oh, well, the Bills can trade away Elijah Griffin or Tim Harris. Like, that's boring. And I don't think that they're going to trade one of their top guys, Trey White, Dane Jackson, Kyer Elam, Taron Johnson. Those guys aren't going anywhere. You heard the way Sean McDermott talked about Dane Jackson a few weeks ago, called him a winner. Praised everything literally about him. The guy that I think makes the most sense is Nick McLeod. Now, there's a piece of me that's very excited for Nick McLeod in Buffalo, especially because we've been told by Leslie Frazier that he's getting opportunities to play some safety. And that makes me very interested because you have a guy with good size, good athleticism, former cornerback. I like that in my safeties. It's something that I liked even before Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde, as guys that had cornerback backgrounds came over and they're amazing safeties. I love safeties that have played corner. I think it just gives you this holistic view of coverage spacing and understanding of how it all works together. And it just works out. Like Aaron Williams is a player that I was really excited when he moved to safety, and he was really good. So I love that corner background. And I think that, a player that I wouldn't even say lukewarm on. I was pretty low on Nick McLeod as a corner. When you introduce the safety conversation, I perk up. I think there's some new life there. There's some room for some upward mobility. I'm intrigued. The Cincinnati Bengals were intrigued. They signed him off of the Bills practice squad last year. Now he was cut and the Bills got him back and all that type of stuff. But as I try to present logical things to you, I think it is worth mentioning that at least one other team wanted this player. And athletic cornerbacks are something the NFL always wants. So do I think it's likely that the Bills would trade any of these corners or even Nick McLeod? No, I don't. But as I put myself through this process and make myself pick a player, that's where I settle. Now for the big one, right? Safety. And the reason it's the big one is because of the Jordan Poyer situation. So Jordan Poyer, Micah Hyde, Jaquan Johnson, Damar Hamlin, Josh Thomas, your safeties on the depth chart. This is tough because the depth options, it's hard to really envision there being a whole lot of appeal for a Josh Thomas or a Damar Hamlin. Safeties in general across the NFL, it's a position that's generally devalued. I know there's a lot of really good safeties, young safeties, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Justin Simmons, Jesse Bates, Budda Baker. A lot of really exciting, good young safeties in the NFL. But every year you see players like a George Odom or a Trey Boston, guys like that just seemingly every year are available late in the process, wind up being reasonable players. Teams just find production from safeties. So it's just difficult for me to see this. And then you have the Jordan Poyer thing. What's the long-term forecast here? And I've talked a lot about Jordan Poyer over the last couple of weeks, and I've shared all my thoughts regarding him. And, I really do wonder what his valuation is. And I brought in the Tyrann Mathieu contract and said, that's kind of your parallel. And he's already getting paid more than that right now. So maybe that doesn't get it done. And maybe there's just this big discrepancy between the number that Jordan Poyer wants and the number that the Bills are comfortable, right? I don't know what those numbers are. I don't know where the middle ground is. So it's very complicated. Now, I think Jordan Poyer is going to be a good player in the NFL for several more seasons. I want him to be in Buffalo. But reluctantly, he's going to be my pick here as the most likely candidate, right? It's not predicting it will happen. It's not saying I want it to happen. But just trying to put myself through this experiment and try to pick something, to me, it's Jordan Poyer. Because I don't see there being any market or interest for a Jaquan Johnson or a Damar Hamlin or a Josh Thomas. And you have at least the contract situation to point to with Jordan Poyer to talk yourself into it. Now, this goes back to what I said about Tremaine Edmonds, where the same thing. You're gearing up for a Super Bowl run and you're going to trade away your all-pro safety that was a captain. It's probably not going to happen. If I'm the Bills, I either do nothing and deal with it after the season or figure it out and extend him. There's not a scenario where I say goodbye to Jordan Poyer right now or before the end of the season. That just doesn't happen. But if the Bills could get something meaningful in exchange, maybe they really like Jaquan Johnson. Maybe they think to themselves, Jaquan Johnson and what we get in exchange, we're comfortable with departing, sending off Jordan Poyer for that. I don't know. But as I try to force myself into this and have logic, Jordan Poyer is where I settle. But again, I don't want it to happen. I don't think it will happen. And that's a really complicated situation. And that's why Brandon Beane gets paid the big bucks to figure it all out. So my picks for defense. At defensive tackle, Brandon Bryant or Elianku. Defensive end, AJ Epinesa. Linebacker, Markel Lee. Cornerback, Nick McLeod. And safety, reluctantly, Jordan Poyer. So consecutive days here of looking at trade candidates on the roster. Be curious for your feedback as always. Let me know what players you think are the most likely trade candidates. Hit me up on YouTube in the comments, on Twitter at the Joe Marino. We have the Locked On Bills Twitter community. Would love for you to find that and become a part of it. A lot of times I will extend our conversations into that Twitter community and just get more feedback. And I'm really looking forward to that once the season started. That's something that I implemented this offseason. So we've not went through a season yet in that Twitter community, but I plan on being even more active in there, once games are going. So go ahead and get in there. Again, Twitter community, Locked On Bills. Let's keep this discussion going. We'll keep this discussion going tomorrow for you on the podcast. Make sure that you come back. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.